Finance and the economy revolve around trust. And I think trust is a variable in the performance of the economy, both on an absolute basis and on a relative basis between countries, that is heavily overlooked. In today's Analyzing Finance with Nick, we're going to be discussing the economic consequences of low trust societies and how people losing trust is expensive. There's a common explanation in personal finance that basically says it's expensive to be poor. And the logic behind that is due to like overdraft fees, having to pay interest on credit cards, having to buy cheaper things at higher volume that break down quicker than quality stuff that breaks down less, being unable to use preventative maintenance for cars or to be proactive and live a healthy lifestyle to avoid getting sick all cost money. And so by not doing those things, however, in the long run, it will cost you more money. So it's expensive to be poor. And like how it's expensive to be poor, it's also expensive not to trust anybody. High trust versus low trust societies can explain a lot of the differences in economic performance. A high trust society, one that respects property rights, has a trusted court system, has a trusted electoral system that people believe in the results, and a high level of just compliance for basic tasks, including tax payments. High trust societies outside of the political side of things, also ones that have high levels of civic involvement, ones where people feel a sense of community, are willing to help out their friends and neighbors and strangers in need. A low trust society is the opposite, where it's kind of just an every man for himself. A lot of institutional corruption, both in the business world and the government world. A lot of dysfunction and inefficiencies for the respect of property rights. Just a general tolerance for crime and messiness and other undesirable things. And yeah, there's a big difference, really, in just the way you live in a high trust versus a low trust society. And as Western economies, particularly the United States, have become increasingly low trust societies, you've seen a lot of negative economic consequences to that. The first main cost of a low trust society is increased regulation and private sector verification to get basic things done in life. Since everybody assumes that people are going to try to screw them or are going to cheat or behave in an unethical way, governments have to have a lot more regulations on business because they feel like the only way the businesses will actually comply and build something that is either safe if it's a safety risk or that is not working against the interest of their customers is if the government threatens them with punishment if they don't. And then on the individual level, people are just afraid that they're going to get cheated or stolen from. So the examples of this is like, look at all the plexiglass that's been required at a lot of drugstores and convenience stores since crime escalated post 2020. And prior to the riots, there wasn't really the need to have to lock every piece of inventory in the store because people would trust that people, if they pick something off the shelf, will go to the counter and check out and buy it. Now, in many cities with lax views on crime, everything is locked because there's not enough of a punishment for crime and people don't really have enough respect in terms of property rights to just not steal or feel any guilt towards stealing from somebody who has more money than them or more assets than them. And so that's a more obvious example. Other ones are the need for scan credit scores before renting an apartment, or having contracts with very strict covenants against moral hazard, and identification verification and a lot of things too. The demand for voter ID is actually another example of a lower trust view of the world because people assume that there's going to be a lot more voter fraud, so you got to pass a rule to prevent that from happening instead of trusting that people are going to do the right thing. That this cost of verification and compliance, both on a regulatory side and just on individual side, has real costs. You have to pay lawyers, accountants, compliance officers, and other people to create that security. Digital technology might be helping with this somewhat, as a lot of stuff can be now done digitally, so the increased cost of verification from a pure financial sense might be lowered, but it's more annoying from the sense of like time spent and customer interfaces and having to have a million passwords for a different bunches of things. And so that is kind of the example of the first immediate cost. The second really cost of a low trust society is in the real estate market. If crime is going up and people don't really trust their neighbors, you need to, the neighborhoods that are left that are perceived to be safe are going to get much higher bids because everybody is going to scramble to the few places where people can trust that their car's not going to get broken into or stuff's not going to get stolen out of their house. In a higher trust society where people feel comfortable leaving their doors unlocked, living in a more working class neighborhood is more viable than it is in a higher crime society where there isn't as much social cohesion, where that is basically asking for trouble, or in the best case scenario, not really being able to sleep at night or being scared walking down the street in the evening because you don't trust that the people around you are going to help you out if you're in need, or they'll attack you. And so the result of that is you'll see flight of people moving out of any neighborhood that has any perception of untrustworthy people in it and cram into the ones that have a reputation of having none of those people in it. And so you've seen this, for example, in Los Angeles, where real estate prices have been particularly bid up in the perceived safe neighborhoods, and whereas everywhere else you haven't seen nearly as much appreciation. But at the same time, crime rates have spiked in those places too. And it makes the housing crisis worse because a lot of available supply of housing that people normally would live in now is basically unacceptable for a vast majority of the population because of the increased lower trust and safety. There's also a lack of civic involvement in general in a lower trust society. If you live in a society where you think that everybody's for themselves and nobody's going to work in the best interest, why would you be involved in community activities to help make your city or your town better? And all this kind of compounds where cities that are full of transients or have low levels of trust decay and become lower quality of places to live. And the psychological effects of that probably damage the economy, whereas places where people still have skin in the game and trust their community become better places to live, and wealth becomes increasingly concentrated in those places. I just noticed the example of when I lived in a very big, crowded, major urban city versus living where I do now in a more well-to-do suburb where people are more involved in their community. It's night and day in terms of level of civic involvement and also how well things are run and how general level of trust in the society is. And I do not really think that is a coincidence. That is also a main problem of this, the cost of low trust societies. And then the last thing really is how it affects work ethic. In a low trust society, a lot of people think, again, the system is just screwed against them. And so they're not going to work as hard because there's like, what's the point? I ever advance beyond a certain point, I will not be rewarded, or they'll find some way to steal it from me. And it also discourages entrepreneurship because in these societies, if a new upstart business is going to be outcompeted by one who has political connections and uses corruption to get ahead and squeeze them out, or if they get too far ahead and they anger people in power, then you can have capricious regulations against them. And it would put them out of business or put them at a major disadvantage. This affects politics too. People who are otherwise upstanding citizens are not going to run for office because they know if the legal system is politicized or they don't trust that it will be a fair way of actually enacting legislation or election standards, people are not going to trust the election results, and they feel like, oh, why would I put myself through all this trouble if I'm going to lose anyway, if it's fixed against me? And then also, if people think the election results are fixed one way or the other, or that there's just a ruling class that's immune to the actual will of the people, then it makes political revolution or civil unrest or other bad things more likely than it needs to be. So overall, this is a pretty short video. Low trust societies are bad for economies. If you look at a lot of countries that otherwise have the same level of average IQ for people, otherwise the same level of natural resources, similar education rates, but have drastically different economic outcomes, a lot of the reasons probably perceived trust, and then into the countries that are in low trust societies having to pay a much higher premium to deal with the costs of people not liking or not trusting each other versus countries that don't. Northern versus Southern Europe is a good example of this. And there are probably several other dichotomies around the world that kind of explain these divergences. Thank you for watching. If you like this kind of content or have any disagreements or thoughts about high versus low trust societies and the consequences, feel free to comment and share. Thanks for watching.